the chemistry seemed fine. Fairly in-depth conversation.
This February, you covered the Oval Office. You mentioned that they had a good kind of rapport, good relationship. That surprised me.
It was a genuine interaction. Prime Minister Ishida talked about, we're going to significantly increase investment into the US. This all was music to Trump's ears. By this, it was a good start. I think, Japan got everything it wanted from that meeting, but we should recognize that this is the first. And the president is going to be around for several years.
Right.
All I can say is good luck.
Okay, good luck. Thank you. はい、ワールドデコーダー始まります。今日のテーマはですね、ブルームバーグの記者が見るトランプ政権と、日本の今後について話します。今日はブルームバーグの、アラスター・ゲイル記者、実際ですね、ホワイトハウスにも取材している記者なので、彼から見て今後の石破政権はどうトランプさんと向き合っていけばいいのかということを聞いていきたいと思います。特に今日は、適切なタイミングというか、トランプさんがですね、本当関税を発表しても日本中が大ショックを受けている日なので、そういった状況の中で早速聞いていきたいと思います。ではゲストをお呼びしましょう。So, Alastair Gale, welcome to our show.
Thanks very much for having me.
So, just for the audience, you are Bloomberg reporter in Tokyo covering Japan and regional security, and you were the former Wall Street Journal bureau chief in Seoul.
That's right, yes. I joined Bloomberg last year after a long time at the Wall Street Journal, so new challenge for me, still covering Japan and traveling around the region. But Japan is a great story right now, so it's a great place to be.
What's your impression of Japan?
Well, I've lived here. I first came to Japan in the mid-90s, so I've seen a lot of change here and a lot of things that haven't changed. Japan for me feels like a very peaceful country. Great food, great climate. My wife is Japanese. We have a house here, so for me it feels like home. So I think it's one of the best places to be anywhere, really. So very happy to be in Japan.
So, Arthur, thanks for coming. And it's like the perfect timing to ask questions because the news revealed that the President Trump unveiled rates of tariffs that was much, much higher than analysts expected. So first of all, what did you think of the news and his new plans for the tariffs?
Right, so there's not really been much clarity over this, in recent days, but we had this announcement yesterday in the US, and it's quite shocking, really. I think, most people expected smaller tariffs, particularly against countries like Japan, which are allies of the US.
Of course.
It's not just Japan, it's South Korea, it's places like Israel, who have quite high tariff rates. So this was a bit of a shock, and you can tell that from the way that the government here has reacted. They've said that this is unfortunate. They want Trump to rethink. So this is a big shock, and the markets have moved a lot over this. So this has now become the top issue, I think, in US-Japan relations. And probably for most countries, the US is a very important market, not just for Japan, but for Europe, obviously for China. So having these large tariff rates is something which is going to be a huge headache, I think, for a lot of countries. But this is the Trump plan. This is what he wants to do, is to try and deal with the trade imbalances as he sees them. So where we go from here is very unclear. But Japan has got this headache now that it has to deal with.
Right. So the White House showed like a chart of selected countries and region, and it said Japan 24%. What do you think of that?
It's a lot, right?
It's a lot,
I mean, we've already had 25% put on autos.
Automobile, yeah.
So it's kind of the same. So basically anything that's sent from Japan to the US now gets a sort of 25% tariff rate. Yes, big implications. I mean, obviously if you have factories in the US, this is a big advantage right now. The question is, how will companies deal with this? The Trump game plan is to try and get companies to sort of move their manufacturing to the US. We'll have to wait and see whether, more Japanese companies think about doing this. But the reality is that the US is a very important market. And so, they have to find ways to cope with this. The government has talked about, they might protest over this at the WTO.
Right.
We're seeing some tension a little bit in the US-Japan relationship now. So it is something which is very shocking, I think. And given that how close the US and Japan are in many other areas, I think has been something which is a surprise. And now the government has to find a way to deal with it whilst keeping a good relationship with the US, which is difficult.
So today I'd like to break down the interview into three parts. First of all, we'll talk about tariffs. And for the second part, we want to discuss the relationship between Prime Minister Ishiba and President Trump. Because earlier this February, you covered the Oval Office and you were just watching the scene. So I would like to talk about the real relationship between the two leaders. And finally, for the third part, the future of Japan-US relationship, because we have long discussion after the World War II. How long should we rely on the United States? That's a big question for us. So number one, about tariffs. So we talked about the 24%. So why is President Trump doing this?
I think that this is something that he feels very strongly about. We know that, even in his first time and even before that, trade was a big part of the way that he views the world. He sees the US as being disadvantaged. He feels that countries, particularly China, but also other countries, including Japan, have had an unfair competitive advantage over the US. And the open global trading system has been something that has disadvantaged the US, and now is the time to deal with that. And his way of dealing with that is by introducing tariffs. So he said, we know that you want to sell things in the US, so we're going to make it more expensive for you to do that. How this will all play out is still unclear. The markets are very in turmoil, frankly, over this right now. There's some expectations that there may be, there's going to be damage to the Japanese economy, but maybe damage to the US economy as well. But this is clearly something that President Trump feels very strongly about. And as we were just saying, it doesn't matter which other countries he has to, put the tariffs on, he's going to do it.
Right.
He thinks that this is something that could deal with the trade imbalances, bring more revenue into the kind of US Treasury, and also use it as a way to kind of, tell other countries that there's certain things that you want them to do. So, for example, Canada and Mexico, he's been very vocal about he wants them to crack down on migrants and drug shipments. So he sees it as an instrument of national policy as a way to achieve the goals that you set out. And in his election, he said, it's time to make America the priority, and we've been disadvantaged. So this is really his kind of top tool to do that. And a lot of speculation about how this would look. Now we know it is very shocking. The tariff rates are very high. I mean, Japan is high, but if you're Vietnam, it's like double that almost.
Right. Yeah.
So
46% Vietnam.
Right, exactly. But these countries have large trade surpluses with the US, and Trump sees that as a problem. What he wants is trade to be brought back to a balance, so the US can sell you as much as is sold into the US by countries like Japan. In Japan's case, he wants US cars to have more of a market share here. I have to say, I'm not sure large American cars are a great fit for Japanese roads, but that's the way he thinks that things should be done. There should be, when he's been to Japan, he said, why aren't there more American cars here, and why are there so many Japanese cars in the US? He sees it in kind of very black and white terms.
Right. Very simple view of the world.
Very simple view of the world, and a very tough tool to deal with it, with tariffs.
It's interesting you mentioned tools, because it's obvious that he'll use this as a bargaining power to make deals.
Right.
So do you think he's intentionally setting a high bar so he can negotiate in a very great way for Japan? So what would he say to Japan for the time being?
Yeah.
What will he ask us?
I think that's a great question. I think what we've seen with President Trump is that his negotiating strategy is to make a big initial move, something which is quite dramatic,
and very
high, and punitive in the case of tariffs, and then to perhaps work back from there. So what we've seen with Canada and Mexico is that there was initial tariffs, and then the tariffs were off, and then they're back on. So it feels like what he's doing now is the kind of starting point for a negotiation. At least that's what countries like Japan are hoping, right?
Yes.
Is that we can talk about this and find a
They
way.
may lower the percentage. Yeah.
Right. I mean, in Japan's case, it would like that to be to be taken away completely. Of course, most other countries, all countries would want the same. But I think it's reasonable to expect that this is a starting point, and perhaps there's an opportunity to negotiate. Obviously, in Japan's case, it does have a lot of investment into the US. It has, when Prime Minister Ishiba was in Washington, he said, Isuzu is going to be building a plant, Toyota is going to be upgrading plants. Japan is interested in the Alaskan LNG project as a way to kind of invest in the US as well. So, these are all things that I think are part of that negotiation. At least Japan wants there to be a negotiation. We don't know yet how that's going to work. I mean, one of the problems, that we've been reporting, the Japanese officials say, is that it's quite difficult to get an actual dialogue going with the US. We hear from our sources, and we've put in our reporting that quite often, in the ministries in Japan, they're not sure who the counterpart is for discussions. So it's very unclear about how the negotiation process will go forward. Japan's approach is to sort of try and form those lines of communication, try and get a dialogue going, try and get an understanding from the other side. In the case of the Prime Minister's visit to DC, he made the case that Japan is the biggest investor in the US.
Yes.
Japan contributes to job creation in the US.
So it's an important country for the United States. So Prime Minister repeatedly told President
Trump.
Yeah.
Right. So keep pushing that message. But the question is, does it make a difference? Does someone, who to talk to on the US side? And also, is that something that the president is willing to sort of accept and then to kind of compromise? So we don't know that yet.
So if Japan were to create this communication channel, what will President Trump say to Japan? Will he say, invest more in the United States, or even he will touch upon defense, national defense, or what's your...
It's possible. He has done that before. We've seen, during the first Trump term, he did say that he wanted Japan to pay more for defense. He kind of sees everything as a negotiation, right? So it's kind of all there. It's all in the mix. So perhaps there's a way to, bring things like defense in. I mean, obviously, Japan is a big customer of the US defense businesses. It buys lots of fighter jets and other things from the US. So that could be part of the negotiation. I think, we have to look at what the president has kind of focused on. He's focused on cars. That's probably something where Japan might need to show some kind of ways to work with him to get his vision of more American cars, in Japan, by lowering things like non-tariff barriers. This is all something I think that the Japanese, government is right now figuring out, how to do this. But basically, Trump sees everything as a negotiation. So you need to put as much on the table as possible and hope that it's enough for him to kind of soften his stance and to say, okay, 24%, appreciate that that's sort of a bit too tough because you've been very nice. You're doing all this investment in LNG. That's the hope, right? That happens. That's every country right now is going to be doing that. So the other issue here is Japan is kind of competing with other countries to have that conversation with him. Japan is a very important partner for the US. Trump himself has said that. US officials say that regularly. So I think Japan will get the opportunity, perhaps over smaller countries that the US doesn't see as strategically as important economically, to make its case. But is it compelling enough for Trump, and is it going to make a difference in terms of getting him to rethink tariff levels? So I guess right now there's a lot of late night meetings to figure this all out.
I can imagine, yeah.
Yeah, I mean there have been really from day one of the Trump administration, but bottom line is everything is a negotiation.
So it's like a battle between countries to fight for Trump's attention.
Right.
And so you lived in Japan, so you know that we Japanese care a lot about rice.
Sure.
And the Ministry of Agriculture is pretty mad about, I don't want to say fake news, but how the Trump administration is, thinking about the rice. And it's kind of a misleading figures and numbers. What do you think about the rice issue?
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, they have brought up this number of like 700%.
700%, which is not true.
Right. So we've looked into this. There is a reference to something around 700% from a document that's 2 decades ago.
Yeah, so it's not completely lie, but it's not misleading.
It's not. I mean, I think there's an agreement that the tariffs on rice are high.
Yes.
Are they as high as 700%? Probably not.
No.
Obviously Japan, the rice market is very important. There's a certain amount of rice which can be imported without tariffs, and then everything beyond that does have a tariff on it. So they're probably looking at the whole picture and saying, well, if we wanted to import X amount of rice, we'd have to pay, a significant amount of tariffs. The other question here is like Japan is not, it's a shrinking population. It's a relatively small market. Is this something that American, farmers want to be import? Is this the place where American farmers want to import their rice to? I don't know the answer to that. There are bigger markets like China, for example. So this is all something that we're kind of learning about as this conversation develops. Agricultural products, there are things that the US wants to export more to Japan, meat products, for example. So they kind of see agriculture as a problem here. What does the government in Japan do about that? Agriculture in general is a very sensitive sector. So we'll have to wait and see. But clearly this is something, it's been brought up by the US. Some of the information is slightly suspicious about the numbers.
Right.
But, I'm sure that the government in Japan will be explaining, actually this is the reality of how things are here, and trying to get, the US side to kind of understand and to listen and to appreciate what, Japan is actually doing.
Do you think President Trump will even listen? Because a lot of media and outlets have pointed out clearly that 700% is not the correct number. And also, a lot of media have pointed out and argued that tariffs won't work, especially in this globalized economy.
Right.
Do you think he will listen to such arguments or claims?
I mean, based on the evidence so far, it seems unlikely. He is very committed to this tariff approach. He is no doubt, when Prime Minister Ishiba was in Washington and they had a summit meeting, no doubt there was information provided by the Japanese side about the reality of US-Japan economic ties. So I think, it was interesting when I was there. So when I was in the Oval Office, listening to the conversation between President Trump and Prime Minister Ishiba, President Trump was actually listening very carefully to what was being said. There's an image of him as kind of impatient,
very irritated, not listening to people.
Right. Obviously, we saw the conversation with President Zelensky, which went very badly, and that got very tense, and basically became an argument. But with the meeting with Prime Minister Ishiba, the President Trump was listening very carefully. He was paying attention basically.
So you were at the scene, right?
So I was at the scene, and that was quite striking.
Wow, that's interesting.
That it was a genuine interaction. So it's very hard for us to get inside someone's head, right? But certainly it seemed like that conversation seemed to be genuine. He was, when the Prime Minister talked about the investment that that Japan was doing, the President, acknowledged that. He acknowledged, the job creation by Japan. He said at the time, Japan has this $1 billion trade surplus, which is kind of not right, but anyway. But we're working on bringing it down, and we think we'll get there. And he gave a very positive message. So, yes, it's very hard to know what his thinking is on any given issue. But my impression was that he certainly listens.
Wow.
And he certainly has an affinity towards Japan. And we saw that in that meeting, he has obviously warm feelings towards former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and he talked about Japan being a great country. So, we can hope that those kind of feelings that he has are helpful, to deal with this tariff issue. Right. But we don't know, how he's going to view Japan's appeals to him. And really it is down to one man. That's just the other issue here, because Japan wants to talk to people around Trump, but it comes down to Trump. What does that guy decide? And that's the most important person. People around Trump will make proposals. There are certain people who are perhaps, friendly with Japan, that are helpful, but ultimately it's one man's decision. And, we don't know what his strategy is going to be with Japan. We do know that Japan is trying to make its case as strongly as possible. How will it go? We'll have to wait and see.
So this leads to our second part of the interview, relationship between Prime Minister Ishiba and President Trump. So you wrote an article in the beginning of February. I will show the screen for our audience. The Japanese version is here, and also there's an English version. So you have it. Yeah.
Yes, this one.
This one, right? So, you are at this Oval Office and you're watching this firsthand. And I'd like to touch upon this. You mentioned that they had a good kind of rapport, good relationship. That surprised me because, President Trump always talks about Shinzo Abe.
Right.
He calls him Shinzo.
Right.
He also meets with his spouse, Akie Abe. They have a close relationship. And we all know that Prime Minister Abe and President Trump had a good relationship. In turn, President Ishiba, we talk about how he's bad dressed in his suit. And I'm very much surprised that he had a great relationship. Could you elaborate on that? Why did President Trump, does he seem to like him?
It certainly seemed that way. There was some concern, of course, going into this meeting. It's a high stakes meeting. We know that the Prime Minister did a lot of preparation for this. We know that, perhaps he's not the most open personality. I think he would admit that himself. But I think he came across well. It was interesting that President Trump constantly referred to, Shinzo Abe and said, Shinzo holds you in high regard. Which was interesting because, you mentioned Akie Abe's trip to the US. In fact, I think she's made at least two. She seemed to have been maybe kind of, this is, this may have been what helped the meeting between Prime Minister Ishiba and President Trump. But, obviously she's the wife of former Prime Minister Abe. Perhaps she said nice things about Prime Minister Ishiba, and that helped things along. But yes, I mean, the chemistry seemed fine. They, had a fairly in-depth conversation in the Oval Office. Usually those things are quite short,
right?
Because it was only meant to be a very brief encounter. Right. But of course, President Trump does like to answer questions and likes the media attention, and so it went on quite long. And Prime Minister Ishiba said a lot of things which I think connected with, how Trump sees the world. The Prime Minister talked about understanding the need to sort of focus on America First issues, concern for people perhaps from areas of the country that are not as well off as the coastal areas. And the Prime Minister drew a comparison with rural areas of Japan, and how it was important in his policy approach to help, the areas of Japan outside the major cities that have kind of got left behind by, economic growth, which I think connected a little bit with the president's view of, the support base for the president is strongest in those kind of middle areas of the US that are not, not the major cities. So there was perhaps some kind of connection on that basis. And I think ultimately, as I said earlier, President Trump has a warm feeling towards Japan. I think he sees it as a, trustworthy ally. He sees it, he just had a meeting with Masayoshi Son of SoftBank. who pledged a very large investment into the US. So I think there is a lot of things that Trump sees as positives in the relationship.
Is it because of the person he meets, like Shinzo Abe, Ishiba-san, or Son Masayoshi, or any special feelings or personal experience, or?
It's it's hard to say. It's hard to get inside his head. But I think those personal relationships are very important with him.
Yeah.
And I think he brought up Shinzo Abe's name at least 10 times in the whole course of not just the meeting in the Oval Office, but the press conference afterwards. That connection is clearly very strong. So I think that has helped a lot. So I think he felt a genuine connection and has a very positive view of Japan. We should remember that this meeting came after President Trump met Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. It came just before he met President Zelensky of Ukraine. He has these kind of other meetings with world leaders where there are major issues.
And there are tensions between them. Yeah,
there's a lot of tension. So, in the case of Israel, obviously the Gaza issue is a very problematic area. The president has his own proposal about how to deal with that. Obviously, the Ukraine-Russia situation, the president has strong opinions. So he's kind of dealing with these crises. In a way, I think Japan is sort of not a crisis, right? So this is something where he's like, let's just get along. Let's these are our friends. There's no reason to kind of get too kind of worked up or angry in this meeting. We're not happy about the trade balance, but basically everything else is great.
It's because Japanese politicians are very nice people compared to world leaders, or it's because we don't have a real like a war between the two countries?
Yeah, I think Japan does not demand a lot of the relationship. Japan will highlight that it contributes a lot to the relationship, investment, job creation.
We always praise the United States.
Right. There's a lot of praise, and let's be honest.
Compliment. Yeah.
President Trump does like to be praised, so I think that's quite effective.
Okay.
So I think the Japanese strategy. We know that there was a lot of planning that went into this meeting. And the proposals that were made for new investment, for how to kind of advance the relationship, Prime Minister Ishiba talked about, we're going to significantly increase investment into the US. This all was like, kind of music to Trump's ears. This is the kind of stuff that works well. So I think that really made the difference. It's the personal side, it's the fact that Japan is a close ally, it's the fact that Japan has a very good strategy to deal with President Trump. All those things that contributed to make this a very good meeting.
So in time of era when there's so many conflicts, do you think this Japanese omotenashi works well against President Trump?
Yes, but every meeting is different, right? And every day is different in the US worldview. So I think we shouldn't get too carried away by this. It was a good start. I think Japan got everything it wanted from that meeting. It got the confirmation that the US security guarantee is solid. There was no pressure to spend more on defense. Trump praised Japan for what he was doing on defense. So it was basically almost like a perfect meeting. But we should recognize that this is the first, and the president is going to be around for several years.
Right.
So Japan needs to kind of stay on top of its game and think, meeting by meeting, how do we approach this each time to make sure it's successful? So credit for Japan here, but it's a long road ahead.
Right. And that'll lead to our final question, the future of Japan-United States relationship, because I agree that Ishiba, Trump had a perfect meeting, but when we look at the tariffs, Trump is not nice to Japan. So what happened next, and do you think he will still be nice to Japan?
I think it's very interesting because I was also at the press conference recently with the Defense Secretary Hegseth, who visited Japan, had a press conference with Defense Minister Nakatani. That, again, was very positive. Japan was very happy with that.
Yes.
The US defense commitment for Japan, according to Defense Secretary Hegseth, is very strong, and they want to increase it. That's great for Japan. That's what they want. So it's a kind of it's an interesting situation right now because Japan is very happy in some areas, and clearly on the trade side, it's very traumatic. So, what's the path through all of this? I think I don't think there's any real crisis in the relationship between the US and Japan. It can be managed. We've reported. I've written about this. For Japan, there really is no plan B. The alliance with the US is very important to deal with an assertive China, to deal with North Korea. Obviously, Russia is a concern as well. Japan is not able to deal with all these challenges by itself. And so having a strong relationship with the US is really important. So I think what we see is, and what we're seeing, day by day, is that Japan is continuing to emphasize this, the closeness of the alliance, solidarity with the US, willingness to work with the US, and in the case of trade and tariffs, trying to find a way to make it work that doesn't damage the relationship. That's very important for Japan, and I think we know from talking to government officials that really is the approach that they've got, and there isn't really an alternative right now. So it's a challenge. These tariffs do complicate matters, but really they just have to find a way to make it work.
You mentioned there's no plan B, and there's an interesting sentence in your article. I'll just read it. So, Tokyo doesn't see any realistic alternative to bandwagoning with the US, even if the ride gets bumpy. So we know that there's so many risks in the relation with President Trump, and we should think of another option to have good relationships, but there's no plan B. We have to stick with the United States.
That's not for me to say. I mean, I'm just, this is what I hear from people here. I mean, at the same time, of course, it is what we're also seeing is Japan trying to have good relationships with other countries in this region, obviously building networks of friendly countries, obviously places like the Philippines, Australia, as much as is possible with South Korea, which is going through sort of some difficult times right now. And even like stabilizing relationships with China, and as well as forming, closer relationships with places like NATO, Europe. All of this seems to be, the strategy to make sure that, Japan has friends in the world. But the reality is, when it comes to protection of Japan and its own security, the alternative, there is no obvious alternative to the US. We have to see how the relationship develops. But right now, I think, the idea that Japan could suddenly separate itself from the US is very hard to see. This, like I said, in this article, the road gets bumpy. It may get very bumpy. This may tariffs may look like the small thing. But
it's just the beginning.
It's just the beginning. But right now, I think what we're seeing is that there is no alternative. And the US Trump has warm feelings towards Japan. Let's hope that is helpful in helping Japan deal with this.
So let's broaden our discussion, because you were based in Seoul. So how can we think about the future of Japan-United States relationship, especially thinking about the East Asia geopolitical situation?
Right. Well, this is a very interesting part of the Trump, approach in terms of security. It does see China as its number one security challenge. And the messages that we've seen so far, including from Secretary Hegseth when he was here recently, is that the US wants to work with allies to, essentially push back on Chinese, aggression and designs on Taiwan, for example. So that's a message that they want to have close alliances with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia. The message from Secretary Hegseth is we're going to increase our activity in this region, and we're going. The U.S. has just announced that they're selling fighter jets to the Philippines. So we're seeing the approach of the Trump administration is like, let's turbocharge, these alliances and have a much stronger, network of allies to deal with China and try and deter China from doing anything aggressive or doing anything more aggressive. Obviously, day by day, there's concerns around Taiwan in the South China Sea. So all of this, I think, is something that Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and some other countries as well see this as a very positive approach. But in the background, there's uncertainty about how the president might look to do perhaps deals with other leaders. He made very clear that he wants to talk to people like Xi Jinping. He wants to talk to Kim Jong-un. That, of course, raises the question of like, okay, you can talk, and what is the outcome? Would that compromise your plan of having a stronger military presence in this region? Would you want to go in a different direction because you've got some agreement with the North Koreans? That, I think, is something that I know from my reporting and what we've written that makes people uncomfortable because Trump is a deal maker, or he sees himself as a deal maker. He wants to do deals. Will a deal be a bad deal for Japan? We don't know. But the message from the US so far has been very strong about the importance of the alliance, with Japan. And I think that's reassuring right now. We've seen Japan being very pleased with that. So again, this is something that we're in the very early stages of the Trump second administration. There's a lot of unknowns. And Trump himself has been very focused on domestic issues, on immigration, on illegal drugs and things like that. He himself hasn't spent much time talking about the Asia Pacific and what he wants to do here. So we have to wait and see, what his view is. But the message so far from the people in his cabinet has been reinforcing the approach almost of the previous administration going much further.
So we need to wrap up. Any final comments for our audience? They're all business professionals because the Trump-U.S.-Japan relationship will, affect their business or even investments. Because if you see the Nikkei, it goes down and up and everything. So any final comments for our viewers?
I think it's a challenge right now, isn't it? Because the Trump approach is like he wants to build up the American domestic economy. He wants bring back manufacturing, create more jobs. Return to golden age of the past. So the question really for businesses is, okay, how are you going to deal with that? Are you going to look elsewhere for other markets? Are you going to, if you're a manufacturer, are you going to move more facilities into the US? So, these are all big questions right now. And in the background, of course, the US is still a democracy, right? It may have a change of leadership.
It's still a democracy.
At some point, they may have a different approach, So who knows, 4 years from now, who the president of the US will be, whether it's a different policy and, tariffs are gone and you don't need to worry about having manufacturing facilities in the US. So it's really a challenge of trying to figure out what the road ahead looks like. I think right now, the message from Trump has been very strong on tariffs. So you have to find a way at least to get through the next 4 years. But obviously businesses need to think longer term. So now some tough decisions need to be made about how to deal with this, and not just for businesses, but also for the government as well. But fundamentally, I think, Japan has to find, both business and the government has to find a way to work with the US. We're getting what the government says here clearly indicates that. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what the future looks like. All I can say is good luck.
Okay, good luck. Thank you. So I'll just have to ask our audience to subscribe to our channel. So
Absolutely. Yeah, keep watching.
Okay. はい、皆さんぜひ見てください。チャンネル登録もお願いします。So thank you, Alastar Gail. Thank you for coming. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks, Ryan.